That, thank you. With that, we will launch ourselves into the next presentation. Laurenti Magesa and Pope Francis on the indigenization of the church in Africa beyond the classicist notion of culture. Oscar Momanyi, please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me pull out my slides here. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to be presenting towards the end because most of the things that I will say here will have some echoes for what was already been said. So I will not go into details explaining. So I'll take some things for granted because really a lot has been said, like the definition of classicist notion of culture, which Professor Dadowski has really did well, and the empirical notion of culture, we heard also about it this morning. So, and many other things about enculturation in Africa, we have heard a lot. So I'll just go through my paper and summarize it as much as possible, and then we engage into a discussion. In this paper, I will explore Laurenti Magesa's vision of the church in Africa in dialogue with Pope Francis' ecclesiology. A glance through Magesa's theological works reveals that he was a theologian passionate about developing an African theology through an in-depth study of African culture, indigenous spirituality, ethics, and how Africans can integrate these elements to achieve an authentic local church. And when I talk about Africa, these two, there's a problem there already, as we have been discussing. The question of culture has long been a focus of African theology, particularly in the wake of the Second Vatican Council and its emphasis on enculturation and the legitimate diversity of local cultures. The classicist notion of culture, which we know already what it is, rooted mainly in the Eurocentric frameworks, often treated African cultural expressions as objects to be corrected or adapted rather than authentic locales for theological meaning, and from the European missionaries who came to bring the good news to us. In classicism, culture is treated as uniform, fixed essences, historical, and European Christianity regarded as a normative expression of the truth. In this notion of the classicist notion of the church, of culture, the church viewed from this perspective is universal rather than particular, whereby the church is viewed as a perfect society, societas perfecta, some Latin there a bit. Robert Balmain, you remember that, Robert Balmain. So church is a perfect society with its laws that can govern it, and it is static, ahistorical, timeless institution above history, and requiring cultures to conform to its structures. So that is from the classicist notion of culture. Church is a perfect society, and the laws are the main thing that hold the church together. The second feature of this view of the church is suspicion of indigenous cultures and traditions, such as the ones of Africa. African rituals, cosmology, and cultural and communal practices were often deemed pagan or primitive, necessitating purification rather than appreciation. And then the third aspect was one-way enculturation. Enculturation in this way, in this view, meant implanting Western Christian forms rather than receiving and learning from local traditions. Both Magesa and Francis critique this static view of culture and ecclesiology following Vatican II vision of the church as a mystery and a sacrament. We know that is from Lumen Gentium. So they are not doing anything new. They're just building from what Vatican II has already said, and Magesa is trying to contextualize it for our East African context. He's from Tanzania, by the way. I will not go into his biography so much, but I will say a little bit about that. And so he's from Tanzania, but he works in Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania. And so he's trying to do that. And Francis is doing it for the whole world. So he's trying to say, okay, we need to be a worldwide church, but still a local church. the local should help the worldwide church be more authentic. So that's what they do. So they critique that, and it comes from Vatican II. Church as mystery, church as sacrament, church is dynamic, church is dialogical, church is historical. So a historical conscious approach to the church based on the empirical notion of culture. So Laurenti Magesa, most of us, we don't know him. How do we?
Sorry.
Okay, Laurenti Magesa. Magesa is a theologian from Tanzania, did his PhD on Ujamaa socialism and the theological impact of Ujamaa socialism in Tanzania. He did his PhD in Canada. The Canadians in the room should be happy about that. Yeah. So, but he went back to East Africa and started working at the Catholic University of East Africa. This used to be Catholic Higher Institute of East Africa. And he brought up very strongly this issue of enculturation, and the bishops were not happy. So they kicked him out. So when they kicked him out of the university, he went back to the parish, and he was doing parish work with the local communities and writing these books. I have the slides of the books, so sorry you can't see them there, but I'll say the titles. Writing those books and working with local communities and kept reflecting about this issue of enculturation. And at the end of his career, the Jesuits took him to Nairobi, and he was a lecturer in the Jesuit School of Theology, where the bishops could not touch him. So he was teaching there for maybe 10 to 15 years, and he taught some of my companions who were behind there. So Magesa's ecclesiology is based basically on his three main monographs. He wrote a lot, many articles, many books, but the three main ones are African Religion, The Moral Traditions of Abundant Life, 1997, Anatomy of Enculturation, Transforming the Church in Africa, 2005, and What is Not Sacred, African Spirituality, which Deogracias was referring to yesterday, like as if it's a gospel. So that was 2014. So really, all of that was done mostly from his perspective as a pastor, from the local, his experience with local communities and his teaching at the Jesuit School of Theology. So Magesa's ecclesiology is rooted in the support for enculturation and appropriation of African culture, spirituality, and the lived experience of African Christians, based on his pastoral experience and teaching. It's centered on several aspects. One, concern for life. Two, enculturation, community, justice, and it resonates with the pastoral vision of the First African Synod of 1994, which aimed to continue the indigenization of the church in Africa following Vatican II's insistence. First, community and life. So African religiosity for Magesa is rooted in life, community and continuity with ancestors. An authentic Christian enculturation must honor the ethic of life in community. So community is much more important. This is demonstrated by the Ubuntu ethic that Oscar was referring to yesterday, so I need not to go into that so much. Well captured in Mbiti's maxim, I am because you are, and since I am, therefore you are. And recently we listened to a lecture here at Marquette. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
great.
You can use this.
Okay, good. Oh, okay, is it moving? Okay, so that is Laurenti Magesa, and then those are the books that I was talking about, Anatomy of Enculturation, What is Not Sacred, and African Religion. And that's him there. Oh, I moved ahead, okay. This is going back again. Okay, let me move on, and time will catch up with me here. So at the heart of Magesa's theology, that is his starting point for all this enculturation, is that Africans revere life in community, and James A. Robinson, who gave a lecture the other day, was speaking about the same idea, that in Africa, and he was talking about more about Igbo and other places in Nigeria, instead of the wealth of the nations, Adam Smith, we speak about the wealth in people. So for us, it's much more about the people. And I think it corroborates that Nigerian experience that James Robinson was speaking about, corroborates what Magesa talks about, is the wealth of the people. Life in community is what holds people together. And the theology must begin from there. And therefore, from that, that idea is mostly found in that first book, The African Religion, the third book, The African Religion of 1997, life as a center of communal life, and communion among human beings shows that harmony exists between living and the ancestors, back to the ancestral issues that we have been speaking about. And in this context, communal sharing, mutual support, resource redistribution are critical in preventing inequality and promoting solidarity and the dignity of the people. And from this perspective, the church should be a community that supports life, and in that way also human dignity, justice, a church that reaches to the needs of the people, listens to the people. The second aspect is the indigenization and reclaiming the dignity of the people and the church. Magesa argues in the anatomy of inculturation, which is there, that the church in Africa must embrace inculturation robustly. In this book, Magesa examines how Christianity interacts with African cultures to create a localized and authentic expression of faith. For him, inculturation is an integration of Christian faith into African cultures, allowing mutual enrichment. So, African religion, and in that book, is a valid religion. And Christianity is also a valid religion. So there needs to be mutual enrichment between these two, so that the Africans can have an authentic expression of Christianity. Enculturation is a dynamic complex of interaction between Christian faith and indigenous African cultures and religious expressions. He emphasizes that enculturation is not merely superficial adoption of cultural elements into Christian practice, but a deep and a dynamic and ongoing encounter between the gospel and African cultures. He says that it's not about replacing a white crucifix with a black crucifix, or maybe you remember the Christmas baby, the white Christmas baby. It should be deeper than that. I think he feels that is a bit superficial. It's not about wearing. Of course, I'm also wearing this, which is from Sri Lanka. No, it's not about wearing this African sharp only. It must go deeper than that. So that is called deep enculturation. The superficial enculturation, but need a deep enculturation. And then the third aspect is the sacramentality of everyday life, which is in everything, what is not sacred, African spirituality. Magesa insists that African culture is imbued with divine presence, and therefore the church must receive African traditions not as threats, but an authentic revelations of God. We talked about revelation here a lot, and eschatology. I don't want to go into that. In the African worldview, there's a holistic view of reality, no distinction between sacred and profane, and the sacred dance comes in there, which we Fikiri did yesterday. I jump a lot there because I don't want to repeat. And then the fourth aspect, that's the third aspect. The fourth aspect is dialogue and openness. There should be dialogue between Christianity, Islam, and African religion, not as African religion as subservient to these two dominant religions, but as equal partners. Because even if African religion doesn't have a scripture, it's oral and it's not one religion, it's African religions, a point that Robinson made very well. He said that African religions is a differentiated religion. It's the multiplicity of religions. It's not one religion. I need to quote him very well. I hope I'm not. I'll get it there. So how this dialogue takes place? So he wants that dialogue and openness to to happen. Now, the fifth aspect, before I move to Pope Francis, that Magesa insists, and this comes in a 2014 article from a conference that our brother Professor Simon Mary was in, and I think this, something that I think we have not spoken a lot about here, is about the changing social context of Africa and how do we bring this into the 21st century. How do I speak to Gen Zs, for example, about ancestors? And that's my problem. I struggle with that quite a lot. And I'm sorry for Emmanuel for asking that question that I asked you. How do we talk about Achebe to the Gen Zs? Or to and they are the majority of the church now. And that's where the church is moving. So Magesa is critical about that a dynamic view of history. It does not romanticize African culture and spirituality and ethics, but acknowledges that there is need of an ongoing reflection and transformation of this in light of the new context. And Lonergan speaks about theology in a new context. Always, the context is always evolving. Or else if we say, we are going back to African culture and we're staying there, we are now making African culture to become a classicist. We're taking back African culture to be classicist, so that when you come to evangelize the West, we say, this is our African culture, and you have to adopt to it. So we are doing the same thing that the missionaries were doing. So we need to challenge that. And Magesa brings that so strongly in this article. It is in a book called African Christians Looking Towards Vatican III. I think some of you can look at that book. Yeah, I think some have read already that book. I know this is smiling there, you know. So. Okay, now, having that in mind, where does Pope Francis come in? Pope Francis offers a complementary vision. So let me move to show you who is Pope Francis. Magesa, you saw him. Magesa, you saw him. Yeah. Pope Francis offers a complementary vision through his pastoral theology of encounter. And I once listened to a powerful lecture by, it's now Cardinal McElroy, who is now in Washington, D.C. He was talking about the pastoral theology of Pope Francis. That was in 2014, and it was so powerful. And this pastoral theology of encounter that resonates with Magesa's insistence on life-centered indigenization is a way that can bring Magesa into our modern time, into the current time, bring Magesa theology into a new context, I believe. Francis emphasizes that cultural plurality is integral to Catholicism in Evangelii Gaudium, Fratelli Tutti, Laudato Si, Querida Amazonia, among others. 5 minutes. So, Querida Amazonia, Evangelii Gaudium, church should be a polyhedron. Polyhedron, instead of a sphere, all cultures are equal. Polyhedron, all cultures bring something into the church. The whole is greater than the parts. But the parts also, the whole depends on the parts. The second document there is Fratelli Tutti, a culture of encounter. We need to develop a culture of encounter. How do we develop a culture of encounter that respects the cultures of the people and brings dialogue and based on not just abstract ideas, but real desire to be in touch with the cultures. And then Querida Amazonia, unfortunately, Francis never did anything, a synod for Africa. So, but we can borrow a lot from Querida Amazonia. Querida Amazonia, place-based knowledge, leading to place-based ecclesiology, Ubuntu. How can our ecclesiology based on Ubuntu, on Palavra and other African values? Now, moving on, beyond classicism, what are the things that we can learn from these two? So, Querida Amazonia, Fratelli Tutti, Magesa, Evangelii Gaudium. First, adaptation to dialogue. We need adaptation and dialogue. So from adaptation to dialogue, we need to move, rather than fitting African culture in pre-existing ecclesial forms, but insist in mutual transformation of the culture and the church. And two, from suspicion to affirmation. No need to suspect African traditions because they are valid, religions are valid, and they are not obstacles. And then from uniformity to pluriformity, the church becomes more Catholic, universal, precisely by becoming more African, more Amazonian, more Asian, more wherever, and it's embodied there. And this points to the emphasis, is emphasized in the, this point is emphasized in the final document of the Synod of Synodality. Pluriformity is important. And Susan Wood in her talk recently was talking about, instead of globalization that levels, she was talking about mondialization. She was borrowing it from economics, I don't know, which is kind of worldwidization that takes local culture seriously. Implications for the church: liturgy, synodal dance, governance, wealth in the people. For example, Ubuntu, consensus, palavra, baraza. So how does it change clericalism in Africa? 3, missionary discipleship. We're not thinking about missionary being from outside. What are the cultures? How do we become missionaries from our own cultures? I'm jumping quite a lot. Small Christian communities, support from church from below, and Professor Simon was talking about that, church from below, where the culture is, the level of culture, church from below, place-based ecclesiology, where the environment, where the people living in the small environment there in the small Christian community can really do something to make the church local. The final point before you cut me off. Theological method. Theological method which centers on African experience, memory, wisdom, and wisdom traditions as legitimate theological sources. And as I was thinking about this, I said maybe I should write a book called Method in African Theology. And since the editor of Method in Theology is here, I thought maybe I should paraphrase the first sentence of Method in Theology, which will be the last sentence of my Method in African Theology. I would like to say that in doing African ecclesiology, theologians must seek, and in paraphrase now Method in Theology, to mediate between the African cultural matrix and the significance and the role of African religion on that matrix. And I think Francis and Magesa can help us do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I thought I was going to be brief, but I know I talk a lot, so I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you. Great presentation. Yeah, Ojefo, you want to come to the microphone?
Oh my God. Because Simon comes now, we will say taboo.
Just speak. I believe they can
All right.
hear you.
Let me get my pen so that I can write down so that I don't forget what you're saying.
Where's the microphone? Anyways, thank you so much, Oscar, for such a very engaging presentation. I know that Ahiohai will ask a question, Simon Mary, because last year, after the death of Magesa, he gave the first memorial lecture to the Pan-African Catholic Theology and Pastoral Network.
I read that paper.
Very beautiful, which he published in the Journal of Moral Theology. But the question I want to ask is, there's a final essay that Magesa wrote shortly before his death, Dreaming About the Future of the Church in Africa.
I've read that one.
Yeah, where he was talking about the dilemma of the church in Africa in the post-missionary period. That the church in Africa, he talked about a church that is a dependent church, a church that is an outmoded church, and a church that is a wait-and-see church. And he says that these kinds of churches has to be replaced by 3 selves: self-government, self-propagation, and self-reliance or self-respect. And I think that that ties in very much with the indigenization of the church. How do we grow a church that doesn't have to wait and see for what is done outside before it knows what it does at a local level? A church that doesn't depend on the wealth and the financial resources that comes from the global north before it's able to do anything in the local context. Or a church that doesn't even have a theological voice because he who pays the piper dictates the tune. and so the church will not go against the person who pays. So how does all of this, because this is considered almost like a testament of Magesa to the Catholic Church in Africa before his death. So how does all of this feature in your idea of Magesa and the indigenization of the church in Africa?
Good. Thank you very much. That's a very good question. The three selves was proposed, I think, in the beginning of the 19th, Henry Venn, but also David Bosch took it, and Elochukwu Nzuku, a listening church, also talks about that. So it's something that we need to keep thinking about it. Our church is still very dependent. We really did depend. I usually lament with my brother there about how we're still a begging church. We need money to support ourselves or to do other things. How can we talk about reliance? How can we talk about self-propagating church? Help me with the three selves: self-propagating,
Reliance, self-government.
And self-government. So how can we have those three selves coming out in the church? And I think Magesa talks about that. And that's why the reason why he talks about we need to keep thinking about the social context, the changing social context, new context. We can't get stuck because things are changing. Donations after the new administration came in the States, the donations were cut and people were crying. Like people who were reliant on the USAID. Many projects had to close and the church was so affected. So how do we go beyond that? It's something that even people like Jean-Marc Engelbert Mveng have been talking about, anthropological poverty. How can we go beyond that? Yeah,
we have 4 minutes to go. So I will ask, let's hear Fikiri while I check if we have anything online.
You had the professor mind.
I don't know, you can dance a little bit here.
That's good to dance. That's good to dance. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was really a very wonderful presentation. Easy bridge, I would say. Okay, some Jesuits in Congo always say that the Vatican prefers a devil they know than a saint they don't know when it comes to appointing people in the church. So you really made an easy connection with between Magesa as a scholar and Pope Francis and the authority of the church. But that is not always easy, especially in African context. There is always a tension between scholars and the authority of the church when it comes to some sensitive issue of the church, and especially in Africa when it comes to inculturation, you have said, decolonization of the church, there is always a tension. So how do you bridge that tension between theology and authority of the church?
Oh, okay, all right. I think if we really embrace the synodal process that Pope Francis has initiated or had initiated, because Pope Francis has helped us to think about in the first few years, it will help us. And we just don't take it the way it is. We need to bring it to our context and find ways to make it an African way. And we have the avenues for that. We have small Christian communities. We have the spirituality for that. Conversation in the spirit that was being used in the synod is basically what happens in the palaver, in the baraza in East Africa, where people sit together, and Simon has written about that. And he's written about everything. So about that's a palaver. What happened in the synod and synodality is really palaver in the African context. So how can we use our own realities, our own spirituality, to bring forth a governance structure that is synodal and consultative? Of course, there's a lot of authoritarianism in Africa. We know it. There's a lot of clericalism. So, but we have the resources to say, to challenge that. I don't know if I have said.
Oh, yes.
I look forward for you to challenge that.
Thank you very much, Momanyi. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure it's an ongoing conversation, so we will continue the conversation. In the meantime, I want to thank all of us for our participation.